Dylan is a guy who does streams, but also is a reporter, great journalist, field reporter, where he's risking his life and he's out on the front line doing great journalism. He's been there since 2022. There's a lot that we can go in, but I would rather have him explain himself and kind of who he is. So, Dylan, we're glad to have you on the stream, man. How are you doing? You just got back from the front lines again, right?
Yeah. I was on the Druzhkivka-Konstantinivka axis, where there's like the center of Russian operations is trying to take that city right now, because it's one of the many barriers they still have to get through in order to get to the last major unoccupied Ukrainian settlements in the Donbass region, which is Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And Konstantinivka is full of a lot of stubborn people, and it's been a very stubborn fight. It looks like they'll probably take it, in my opinion, by sometime in late summer going into winter. But in that area right now, it's like 24/7 drone coverage, a very, very active axis. And I wanted to go out there to see what it was like, because I've been filming on the Konstantinivka axis over the period of a year, as I following my Pokrovsk documentary, which was also over a year. So I'm trying to basically document the battle of what might be the final chapters of the fight for the Donbass region, which I think is really, really important.
Wow, that's fantastic. There's a lot that we can go into.
Yeah, well, I want to ask really one quick question. You said there what might be the last of the battle for the Donbass region. What's going on there? What do you mean by that?
I mean that there's two things that are colliding. On one side, you have the Ukrainians, which have manpower problems, the Ukrainians, which have questions about support from foreign countries, whether they will get it, whether they won't get it, and how that's straining their ability to defend themselves. And you have the Russian problem of continuing to be able to recruit new people when their budget is strained. The amounts that local governments have to offer in bonuses and advances are ballooning in size. The average age of a Russian soldier has gone from 40 to 50 when we talk about the people who are recruiting for Russian military service. So this is very much a war of people with gray hairs. And so you have that combined with the ever-building pressure of the Ukrainian drone campaign hitting Russian oil refineries. And once the Strait of Hormuz opens again and global oil prices start to go down, combined with the Ukrainian drone strikes, that's going to mean a lot of pressure on the Russian economy. And so these two things are colliding, as the Russians have also blown through a lot of their mechanized equipment, making mass mechanized assaults as we've remembered them in yesteryear, not really a possibility right now. So there's only a grinding advance. And so the question is, who will be grinded down first, essentially?
Right. Okay. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. So what I want to do is we're going to take a step back. We're going to take the 10,000 foot view, because there's a lot of people who do not know who you are and should know exactly who you are. Man, how the hell did you just decide one day to just get into this thing? Because you've been there since 2022. Like, take us from the beginning.
Yeah, April of 2022. So essentially a month and a half into it, once I saw that the situation was generally stable and what a lot of early predictions were about the war, like that it, number one, wouldn't happen. And then when it did happen, number two, well, it'll certainly be a 2-week-long scuffle. That, you know, the idea was you just kick down the door and then the whole rotten edifice would just kind of collapse in on itself, which didn't give the Ukrainians really much credit at all. And also really overestimated what the Russians were going to be coming to the table with early on. You weren't seeing like the full mass of Russia crashing into Ukraine in 2022. You saw about like 180,000 men out of, you know, a country of 130 million. They really underestimated what the Ukrainians were going to be able to do. And so I see a bunch of professors in suits and talking heads on TV saying, well, the war won't happen. And then it does, and it embarrasses a bunch of people in established media and alternative media. And then those same people say, well, this will be over in 2 weeks. But I'm following the reports, and I'm listening to Russian radio communications, because that stuff early on, it's all on the airwaves. You could tune in to Russian radio communications for the first 3 weeks because they were speaking on open radio channels. And so I was just live listening to, oh, the Russians say they're getting shelled at this point. Oh, the Russians say they're getting bombed at that point. And it just was not melding with what a lot of the professional war commentary class, I don't know what you want to call them as a grouping, but it was not meshing. And so I thought, I've gotten a little bit of increased intention because of the way I'm covering the war, just trying to follow day by day fighting and trying to keep that and my personal beliefs as two separate entities so that people could get a reliable source. And so I said, how can I improve my coverage? Do I get a bigger studio or do I go on the ground? And I decided I'd rather spend the money to go on the ground. And what turned into a 1 week in bed turned into going on 5 years now, because I've gotten a real love for this type of work.
Wow, very noble work, I will say, especially what he said, Tim, about trying to separate like personal view versus like the actual like reporting that you're bringing to people, the facts on the ground. I mean, that's why I kind of call myself a pundit and not a journalist, is because this is what it means to be a journalist.
100%, not having any bias and trying to give people the facts, because that's what's missing today in media. And so like we're very happy to have you and people like you doing things like that. Now, when you went into Ukraine to start off with at the beginning of the conflict, like were you scared? Were you nervous? Like that's a big deal to decide that that's very dangerous. And I'm sure like your thought process has changed, but something's kept you there for 5 years, as you had mentioned.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just I keep getting offered opportunities, and when those opportunities come, I just kept making the mental decision to take them instead of just being like, you know what, let me just, stand back a little bit. Because at first it was supposed to be, I'm going to go to Warsaw, I'm going to interview refugees, and then I can go home and, enjoy my crabbing in Maryland, do all my whatever I want to do back in my home state, But as I interviewed more refugees, I was like, I think I could get a better understanding if I went a little bit closer. Let me go to a border town called Lublin, where a lot of refugees were channeling through in the early days. Let me talk to local mayors and administrators, who were the main people who responded early on. The national governments and heads of state, they take a lot of credit. But honestly, it was local government, local people working with mayorships and like county councils that did most of the early refugee response and helped a lot of these like women and children that were fleeing the initial waves of the war when the country was on fire and nobody really knew what was going to happen. And as I got more and more understanding, I just kind of had this compulsion to keep going further and further, and turned into a career. And now I do this basically full time. I'm in Ukraine the majority of the year, and I go home for holidays, special occasions, and like family events and such. So I really appreciated the opportunity I've been given.
Wow. Yeah, and so what I'm also curious, because we're going to talk about the conflict itself and what you're
questions.
saying. Well, yeah, he's got a ton of questions. I want to hear this just a little bit to begin with, because what most people are seeing is just the headlines, right? They're just watching it through their phone. Like Rex and I do the same thing: news articles, videos, you name it. For you on the front lines, interacting with Ukrainians, I'm not sure if you've interacted with the Russians. What is it like?
I have.
Yeah, humanize this for us and make us understand, what is the sentiment? What does it feel like for somebody who is actually involved in this conflict? Because both sides, morale, but like also both sides have nationalism at play. They're angry emotions. What is it like for these people?
Sure. So I'll speak mostly to the Ukrainian perspective, because I have spoken to Russians, but most of the Russians I've spoken to are Russians fighting on the Ukrainian side. People in organizations like the Russian Volunteer Corps who want to see like Putin's downfall. And so they have a very specific view, and trying to speak as if their view represents the broader Russian view, I think would be disingenuous. So I'm going to mostly speak to the Ukrainian view, but I also constantly read the Russian press, Russian newspapers, Russian war bloggers, try to just read like random Russian civilian accounts so I can speak a little bit to the average Russian mentality. In Ukraine, the mentality generally is, at the moment, is that the war is continuing. They want to see it end. They'd like to see the fighting stop. But at this point, the general perspective is that there doesn't seem to be an immediate option for that the war is dragging on. Where the last year there was a lot of confusion. There was talk there was going to be a 24-hour peace deal, and then it was like, well, it's not a 24 hours, but it's around the corner. And then there was all this engagement, but then the engagement always felt generally surface level, that it didn't really get to a lot of the nitty-gritty details of like, okay, would civilians be able to come back to displaced territories in the Donbass? Would the 40 Baptist and Protestant churches shut down in Mariupol? Would they be able to reopen? Would there be any settlement to, the Russians like digging in and actually moving their heavy armory back? A lot of these finer details didn't get worked out. They didn't get worked out with the Ukrainians directly. None of the negotiators ever went to Kyiv. And so it always felt like there was like these big promises of peace negotiations, big promises of successes right around the corner. But I never got a reading either from the intelligentsia, from people somewhat involved in negotiations that I know, or from people on the ground that there was a general upswing and hope that negotiations were going to succeed immediately after like the first few weeks of the Trump presidency and that 24-hour promise that a lot of Ukrainians heard. And some, I mean, my main fixer in the country, the main person who's worked for me, he wanted Trump to win because he believed Trump would come in as, he's the big cowboy. He's the American cowboy. He'll come in, he'll say, hey, come on, you know, Putin, get this war over with. And then they would freeze the line where it is. And then maybe in a decade or however long, he'd be able to go back to his home in Donetsk. Who knows? But that's not what happened. And so the general belief is, well, if Trump and Putin couldn't settle it, then obviously the Russians want to keep going on with the war, that we have to keep fighting. We don't want to, but there's not much of a choice. And that is the majoritarian position. There's a bunch of positions under that. There's people who would fight to like, I will fight to the bitter end. There's no circumstance where I want peace with the Russians because they're occupying my home. There's people who are like, let's just freeze it where it is, but they're not even agreeing to freeze it where it is. So, you know, we have to keep fighting. There's people all along that spectrum, but the majoritarian position is this sucks, but we have to keep fighting with a little bit of hope about the long-range campaign because the Ukrainians have had some successes there, and without money, you can't fight a war. And so there is some hope there, but that's about it.
Yes, it takes money to win a war. That's something that we actually often say on the show, and something that we often discuss in relation to just Ukraine and like the modern battlefield in general is the reality of drone warfare, right? Because it seems like we're getting into this weird territory, kind of like World War I, where you have the appearance of chemical weapons, and it's this new thing, and it's so horrible and terrifying. And I don't know, just some of the footage that I've seen that's come out of the Ukraine war, of soldiers being chased by FPV drones, kind of taunted by FPV drones. It appears to happen on both sides. Like, it's just absolutely brutal. And from what I've heard, you know, there's areas that are like 100 miles long or however long, I don't know because I'm not there. Maybe you can give perspective, that are just covered in fiber optic cable. So what's the reality of drone warfare as someone that's been there, and how do the people that have to fight in that feel about it?
Sure. So I've seen the transformation of drone warfare from start to finish. And I've been working on a project for a long time called the Ukrainian Drone Bible, which is trying to embed with every single type of drone team possible and as many conditions as possible, understanding everything from piloting the drone to soldering the drone, manufacturing the drone, just everything possible about understanding this evolution in drone warfare. Because I think I look at this almost pseudo-religiously. Like, this is an extremely important moment in the development of warfare, and it needs to be documented aggressively. So at this point, there's a kill zone within 10 to 15 kilometers of the line of contact. And the reason I call that the kill zone is that there's so many drones that if you walk around for a minute or two, you will hear their buzzing, you will have to take cover. Just as an example, not to pick out a specific area for like focus, but in Druskivka, which I was just on that axis, we probably had 15 to 17 interactions with drones within an afternoon, within a day's of work. We had to walk something like 22 kilometers because driving in and out of that area, it was just too heavy. And the people that we did see drive in and out of that area, I mean, we saw vehicles like on fire because of just how constant the drone presence was. Now, that is true both on the Ukrainian side and that is true on the Russian side for the dominance of the drone kill zone, as you could call it. Then there is a further area, you could say 15 to 30 to 40 kilometers back, which now is being struck more and more by mid-range strike drones and some other like FPV drones that they've been able to alter to get them deeper and deeper in. Sometimes they have them on mothership drones, but this is a lot less frequent, but is becoming something you see a lot in Kramatorsk right now, which has gotten closer and closer to Russian positions. And so civilians driving around, aid workers driving around, and military personnel driving around, they're all at risk. And then further out, you have the longer range drone program. This is where you get your Shahed 136, of Iranian invention. That's where you get on the Ukrainian side, the longer range drones that have been striking Russian oil refineries and digging deep into the Russian countryside, targeting the economic support for the war. And so I think that it can be separated into short range, kill zone, mid-range, logistic strangling, and long range economic war. which usually targeting factories, energy, stuff of that sort.
So what it sounds like to me is like the fears of what was deadly has transitioned since you have seen this conflict unfold. Because at the beginning of the conflict, what I used to see that people were concerned about was the jets. Artillery was a very big one. I used to hear about shellings and missiles and those types of things. Now, is it more so that it just became that drone was just cheaper? Somebody figured out like that's the way that we need to go, and then the Russians were like adjusted accordingly, or the Russians just like out of that stuff and like half of it's been destroyed? Because that's the part that's really hard to understand is like what's going on? Why did everything change so quickly over the last, I would say, the last couple of years?
I think it's push and pull factors. The pull factor is innovation that, yes, these are cheaper. I mean, I think Magyar said he's like the head of the Ukrainian drone forces. He's very, very effective at what he does. It's men like him that has kept Ukraine like able to fight the largest country on the planet, which is quite a feat considering the circumstances they're under. He said that it costs about $868 or $78 to kill a man with one of these drones. And when you do that math versus, an artillery shell, and you have to fire how many artillery shells that could cost thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of dollars potentially, definitely depending upon if you have more targeting technology embedded in the system. The economics just doesn't work out, especially when you don't fire one shell. You fire 2, 3, 4, 5. You've killed 2 people, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, these drones, you usually have to use a lot of them in order to actually get one kill in mass. But when you talk about the best drone teams Ukraine has to offer that are really good at targeting, that have been doing this for a long time, they can do a lot more damage with a lot less money than an artillery team could when it comes to the amount of vehicles being taken out over a wider area, because they have better targeting, they can readjust, whereas the artillery shell, you fire it and that's it. You put in a coordinate, it's gonna fire as close to that coordinate as you want. But if that car is moved along the road, then you miss the car. The drone can target, the drone can move. And so it's cheaper, it's got the targeting ability, and a drone team is easy to hide in a tree line. And a big ass cannon isn't.
Right.
Now that makes a lot of sense. So you're talking about kind of like these different ranges of strikes, and something that I've been following, and I watch a lot of geopolitical media, is the strikes that have happened inside of Russia, namely the strike that took place on the nuclear triad, on those nuclear bombers where they had the 18-wheelers come in that didn't know what they were carrying, and the drones pop out of the top and then pew, and
blow up all of those like billion-dollar planes.
Yeah, Operation Spiderweb.
Yes, Operation Spiderweb, and then the subsequent attack on Putin's residence. Do you know anything about those two events? Maybe you could elaborate for the audience who are aware.
I can elaborate on Operation Spiderweb. As for if there was a serious attack on Putin's residence, I think that's still up in the air. I really don't know.
Okay.
It also wouldn't make much sense to me because I just find it hard to believe that if the Ukrainians got him, they would get him in his bed. It's just very, and not to mention he's like barely in his residence to begin with. So it's just like if it was an attack on his residence, it might have been more a statement of we can strike your residence, less than we're actually trying to kill Putin, because it would be.
I think it was a neighboring military facility, so I don't want to get that confused. But yeah, I'm sure you're correct. But what about Operation Spiderweb? What happened there? Yeah. That's like James Bond stuff. That's
yeah, so the Ukrainians got a bunch of shipping containers. They filled them with FPV drones, and then they got Russian drivers. They gave them an order, like just move it to this location and wait for further instructions. They do so, and then the tops of these shipping containers open up for these FPVs in range of major Russian targets, air bases, mostly Strategic Bomber Command, and like areas where they use heavy bombers to bomb Ukrainian cities. So these are major air bases that have been used to bomb Kiev, Dnipro, Lviv, major cities, and they mostly targeted the bomber infrastructure. So aircraft that have been used not only as part of their Strategic Bomber Command for their atomic arsenal, but also as direct participants in the war. Which made Russia's position of arguing about like, well, these weapons were part of the Strategic Bomber Command, you can't attack these, It's much harder to make that argument on the international stage if you were using those exact planes at the time that they were being struck to bomb Ukraine. And so it was a big humiliation for Russia on the world stage when it comes to its ability to both protect its nuclear triad and also the fact that the Ukrainians were able to penetrate so deep. But it also poses, I think, a risk for any future leader, the Ukrainians, the United States, India, China, whatever country. You don't need a lot of space to fit a bunch of FPV drones in a van and a truck. And whether you're an intelligence agency, whether you're a terrorist organization, whether you're a military organization, or whatever organization, you're being a cult for all I know, if you have the knowledge of how to do it, I don't understand why any of these organizations couldn't repeat said behavior. And so this is just something that governments all around the world are going to have to adapt to, because it wasn't just the United States learning from that. It was also organizations like Hezbollah or other groups.
Wow. Yeah, that is a good analysis. I mean, I always say this. I'm like, Ukraine-Russia war is almost like the biggest play box for like all of the weapons you could possibly use, and just seeing how modern warfare actually works in practice, because
Research and development.
right.
Right.
And then, so I want to get into more some of the anecdotal things for your own personal experience. What is the craziest thing that you have seen since being in Ukraine? Like, I'm sure you probably, have you had any near-death experiences? Have you?
Oh, yeah, but that's not crazy. That's. I mean, you're in a war zone. Like, that's gonna happen. To me, that's not crazy. I think, to me, like, crazy is, I don't know, the first day I'm in Ukraine, I find out Lviv, like, alcohol's banned. I can't get liquor, and I'm in Ukraine. That's crazy to me. That doesn't make any sense. That's not what I was led to believe was going to happen in this country. Crazy to me, if I was to talk about just things that have shocked me, would probably be the human safari in Kherson. This is just the human safari in Kherson. Essentially, is that Russian drone pilots in Kherson have an absolutely horrible reputation. A reputation for targeting civilians, a reputation for targeting firefighters, a reputation for targeting ambulance workers, a reputation for targeting the civilians, then the ambulance crews come. So then they target the ambulance crews, and then the firefighters come to put out the fire, and then they target the firefighting crews. And the thing is, I remember being down there trying to collect evidence, like immediately after the Novgorod Dam exploded. They were bombing the city within 48 hours, hitting aid teams. And I went down there like, okay, I'm gonna have to gather evidence, and oh snap, my friend just got hit, they're bombing us. Well, afterwards, we're gonna have to like adjust the trajectory of the shot, see like, oh, how did it come in, prove it was the Russians, and then just post it all on social media. They just post the video of bombing us on social media, they post the videos of them bombing aid workers on social media, they post of the firefighters, of the ambulance crews, and of like a lot of times even just elderly people walking around. They'll either say that the targets are military, or if they don't look like military, they'll say they're assisting military. So if you see an elderly person being blown up, they'll say, well, that elderly person was bringing food to the armed forces, or that elderly person was doing X, Y, Z. And of course, in our case, that was not the case. We were there on the riverbank because elderly people and disabled people were drowning in their homes after the dam exploded. And so we were trying to film the aid operations there. And I know John, who was there, he got hit. He was an elderly British expat. I know other aid workers that were showing me their injuries when we were there at the time. It's really hard to film down there because of just the gigantic level of security risk. But I've seen some like pretty terrible stuff down there, and I think the human safari should be talked about more.
I see. Yeah, these are significantly underreported stories. Like, the average person here is not going to really know about that. This is the first time that I've heard about these situations, and I definitely want to do my own research. Now, I know you said earlier, you were like, well, that's not...
Let me just also say, when we were there with those teams, it was a private military company that did the strike on us. It was a Russian private military company that worked for the head of the Crimean occupation, who also happens to be former mafia. A lot of times the behaviors of these organizations come from, to be frank, just the caliber of the leadership that they have to bring themselves to. And when you have a lot of the criminal elements, when the Russians took over, were the most willing to work with the Russian occupation and the most willing to like organize a military state for them.
Well, let's talk about the impact of like private military contractors, mercenaries. What is that like in this war?
Oh, I mean, they're everywhere. I mean, on the Russian side, of course, there was the most famous, the Wagner Group, which is now the Africa Corps, which is mostly being seen in locations like Central Africa and Mali at this point. But there was other PMCs as well. You could go all around and find all crazy companies that have PMCs. Gazprom, of course, a very famous Russian energy company. They have a private military corporation. And now the Russian government has actually loosened the restrictions. So organizations like Gazprom and banks, they can actually now buy air defense systems to protect their assets because of the growing Ukrainian drone threat. Then you've got, the foreign volunteers on the American kind of U.S., Europe, or just like Ukraine aligned side. That's where the majority of these fighters are coming from. Most of them are ideological when it comes to the volunteers. But then you've got certain groups where it's a lot less ideological, where, for example, the Colombians are largely coming here because they know they'll get a good check, and they know at home the Colombian Armed Forces does not get paid as well as Ukrainian armed servicemen who are actually serving on the front line. But if you're talking about an American soldier or you're talking about a European soldier, most of them are ideological volunteers. They're people who are fighting because they believe in it for whatever reason. It could be that they don't like the Russians because they're Finnish, Estonian, Latvian, and they believe the Russians are going to attack them next. It could be that they're American and they believe that America made a promise to help support Ukraine, and they're here to help deliver on that promise. So a lot of them are, when it comes to the American perspective, are war on terror vets who felt that they didn't fight a war that was worth fighting for, and now this is that war where they could feel like they're doing something that's worth fighting for. But those are the foreign volunteers versus the foreign, I guess you could say, military contractors. Mercenaries is the word people use, but it's also not very technical. But yeah, private military contractors is.
It sounds pretty global to me. That's kind of what I'm hearing, right? Because we had the North Koreans came in for the Russians too, right? Yep. Talking about operations from military or mercenary groups in Africa and other stuff like this as well.
There's not a PMC when it comes to North Korea. It's direct. These soldiers believe that they are coming to Russia to fight against the Ukrainians for North Korea's interest. It's not about it's not a private military corporation. It's literally an arm of the state. It's basically North Korean military units fighting on the Russian side of the border. Fighting the Ukrainians, particularly around the Kursk area. For the private military company side, it would probably be the Africans who have signed up to fight on the Russian side. Sri Lankans, Cubans have signed up to fight, many of them in confused manners, where some come because they want to, and then afterwards they say, oh, I had no idea what I was signing up for, but they're just kind of saying what they need to in the circumstances. Others seem to genuinely have been confused of whether they were coming to Russia for a construction contract, a gymnastics contract, some sort of student learning opportunity, and then they get to Russia and they're like, that's very nice. I have your passport. That's going to stay in my pocket. We have a conversation to be had about your future work endeavors in the country.
No.
It's been widely reported by the families themselves too, talking about how they were told, hey, they had a construction opportunity, they had this, they had that, and then all of a sudden they're in the armed forces because that's what the contract really was for. There's a lot of predatory military recruiting going on.
You're saying that that's on the Ukraine and Russia side, is what you're saying? Or
I haven't. There has been military recruiting for economic reasons on both sides. The misleading of people saying that, hey, there is people here giving you construction contracts, that's only been reported on the Russian side so far. When it comes to the economic side for the Ukrainians, you're mostly going to see Colombians, at least in my experience. A lot of Colombians come to Ukraine for a check.
So there's conscription on both sides. I think that's fair to say.
Yes, there's not conscription in Russia in the way that you get conscripted and now you're fighting in Ukraine. You get conscripted and you're going to be doing border guard work, probably. That's likely what they're going to assign you. The only conscripts that are forced to fight in Ukraine are those who are in Ukraine. So let's say the Russians take over a village and you've survived the Russians taking over and you survived the worst of the fighting. You can then be pressed into military service against your former neighbors, which is against the Geneva Convention, which Russia did sign on to, but they say it's all Russia, so they can do it. Whether or not the international community considers it occupied territory. The Ukrainians, they have conscription all the way.
Yeah, I mean, the footage of people being kidnapped in the white van is the only thing that runs through my mind when I think of people who have been conscripted. But I'm sure when you talk about all these different countries, we're not talking like tens of thousands of people. Like I know North Korea, they sent in over 10,000 soldiers. If correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Yeah, they sent in quite a lot.
Right. And as far as Ukraine and these other people who are volunteering or being kidnapped, are we talking just hundreds? Or are we talking several thousands?
It depends what group you're talking about. If you're talking about Belarusians, there's like a couple of thousand like Belarusians who view the war in Ukraine as an extension of their fight against Alexander Lukashenko, or the idea that Russia has too much influence in Belarus, and so they have their own individual reasons. There's quite a few Poles. I would probably put the Polish number at maybe like 1,000. Americans, there's hundreds of Americans in the country continuously fighting. I think the number of dead Americans is also in, I believe, like in the hundreds or something along those numbers, Americans who have died fighting in the country. And so on the Ukrainian side, it's usually, for most Western European countries, they're going to talk about dozens of people or a couple hundred people, with a few exceptions where it's a couple thousand because they have more interest in the direct outcome of the war.
Okay, so how many people actually have died in this conflict? Because I can't get the numbers straight. I know there's propaganda on both sides, so I have to take both numbers from either side with a grain of salt. But in your experience, or what you have actually researched, what would you put the numbers at for both sides? Ukrainians losing more, Russians losing more? How many? What's the numbers like?
Oh, the question isn't really about who's losing more. It's pretty universally accepted at this point that the Russians are losing more men, just due to the nature of the battlefield. They're marching forward. They're the ones that have to move forward. They're the ones who therefore have to put themselves under the drone threat in more instances. The way they move forward is through infiltration tactics, which are inherently high attrition tactics, where you essentially take teams of 2 or 3 people, you have them march forward. This is how you get these like insane drone videos to look at as an outside perspective, where it's just one guy wandering through a field. Why is it just one guy wandering through a field? That's infiltration tactics, where they essentially want to have so many people spread across so many positions that they eventually build up by crawling forward. And then in a team of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, once enough people have gathered, then they can assault maybe the stronger Ukrainian positions. But in order to do that, it means higher attrition. It means a lot of your guys just getting lost to drones, pedal mines, or whatever you could find out there in the high grass of eastern Ukraine right now. As for the actual casualty numbers, I've seen estimates on the Ukrainian side of about like 180,000 dead to like another 200,000 wounded, 220,000 wounded on top of that. That sounded like a number that was realistic to me. On the Russian side, it sounded something more close to 400,000 to maybe something 450,000, something in that range, with another possibly 600,000, 700,000 wounded. It's really hard though to estimate because the Russians really don't allow like international investigators to like go in and like collect this data. I would say that the best bulk casualty, because these are very rough estimates, I'm going to be very blunt with you, would probably be well over 1 million casualties at this point. And it would not be far off to think that by the end of this year could be 1 million deaths.
Wow. And on you were just describing the Russian side. Ukrainian side, what are we talking about for numbers?
I think you said
yeah, I said about 180,000 to about 220, 230,000 wounded. But the wounded number changes because, for example, the last stabilization point I was at, people lost their foot to pedal mines. These tiny little green mines that the Soviets used to drop in Afghanistan. Kids used to think they looked like toys, pick them up, arm would blow off. But they look so tiny and innocuous, and they can hide in the high grass. A guy put his foot on it. He lost his foot. The guy next to him lost most of his foot. It was like a sock, what was left. And the 2 people next to them, they got hit with shrapnel. Now, those 2 people at the end that got hit with shrapnel, they might be able to go back out in the week, like a week later, depending about how bad the shrapnel injury is. If you just had a little shrapnel in the ass, you're going to be fine. You could be back out there in a week. If you've got shrapnel that's deep and it hit a bone or something, and you know it's deeper in your body, then maybe it's going to be something more long-term. And so a lot of these estimates change depending upon how they actually register wounded, what counts as a casualty, because the majority of people are wounded.
Okay, so you seem to be very familiar with the Ukrainian side. I want to ask this question because there's been a lot of talks of like like the West is going to send in like various like wonder weapon, whether that's a Storm Shadow, the Leopard
Yeah.
tank. Something that I've heard a lot about is the Flamingo missile, and I wanted to ask you about that. If you had any knowledge on that you could share with our audience.
Sure. So I think most wonder weapon reports can I cuss here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, most wonder weapon reports are shit. For the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, mostly what you're reading, and if you start looking at it like this, like at it through this lens, it makes so much more sense. Most of these reports are written up by defense companies in order to sell their weapons, and whether you see it on the Russian side or Ukrainian side, it's essentially a giant ad. Not even for you, just the idea that the general vibe about this weapon will bubble up to decision makers who will then bid on contracts. This is, of course, sometimes combined with kickback schemes when we're talking about Ukrainian and Russian politics, but that's how it works. The Oreshnik is not that impressive of a weapon. It is an old Soviet missile that they just basically show off like a toy every few months. They either don't have enough fuel for the thing or they don't have enough chutzpah. I don't know what it is. But
Is that the truth about the Oreshnik? Because the videos
yeah, it's shit.
bad.
I mean, it's impressive on video, but it hasn't killed anyone. Like it's damaged some cars. I think it damaged a parking lot. I think it damaged a garage.
Okay.
But it's been going on 5 years, and I do believe that if the Oreshnik could do something impressive on the battlefield, why haven't they loaded it up with thermobaric warheads? Thermobaric warheads load up an Oreshnik, launch it into an area where you can do real military damage, but instead, every time negotiations come around, it gets brought out as if it's Victory Day parade and they need to make a statement. So to me, that's the Russian wonder weapon that I don't believe. On the Ukrainian side, there's a bunch of different examples of this as well. That's just the Russian example of it.
Do you think that one side, both sides, neither sides, are they looking to escalate or de-escalate? Like, what is the end game for Ukraine and what is the end game for Russia? Because I've heard all these things ranging from like they want the Donbass, they want to go all the way to the Dnieper River and beyond and take Kiev. I don't know what's true. You're there. What do you think?
Sure. Did you still want a description on the Flamingo, though? Or did you want me?
Sorry
Yeah.
about it.
No,
Go ahead.
no worries. I'm just, I'm a motor mouth, and, this is my wheelhouse. The Flamingo is not as good as American long-range missiles of a similar quality. I mean, it's not like developed to that level. But what the Flamingo does is it gives Ukraine the ability to launch a few of these heavier payload, long-range missiles at Russian defense companies, and they have been able to make impact. Now, I would say that this is basically the little rocket that could, and they've jerry-rigged the engineering a bit, and I think a lot of the Firepoint press releases they put out, like everybody who's in the know sees that it's not amounting to what they said it would amount to, but the fact that it has made impact and has further stretched out Russian air defense systems still has enough service that you could consider it a Ukrainian advancement in the long-range war. Because before, they had no weapon like this. Before this war started, the Russians said that they wanted the Ukrainians not to have weapons of 125 kilometers in length. Now we're talking about missiles having 1,000 kilometers in length. I mean, we're in a totally different range of capabilities now at the disposal of the Ukrainians, but it's not a wonder weapon because it's them taking their first step as an independent state into this type of weapon arena. And so, yeah, it has a lot of problems, which you would imagine that would come with that. The next question, I'm sorry, could you remind me?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one side, both side, Ukraine, Russia, neither, whatever. Do you think that they want to be on the de-escalation path or the escalation path? What is their end game? What's the Ukrainian end game? What's the Russian end game?
I think that there's a short-term end game and there's a longer-term end game, right? Where the Ukrainians, at the end of the day, they want the Russians out of their country. And for Ukrainian leadership, that still includes everything that is occupied. That doesn't mean they want to achieve that necessarily right now. They don't see that as achievable right now. They probably knew that wasn't achievable back in 2023, immediately, even before the counteroffensive, which many people had warnings of it was probably not a good idea. The way it was conducted along 3 points, the idea that you are attacking the one place that the Russians know you're coming, and going to be attacking on. But I think that when it comes to the Ukrainians and where the Russians stand right now, the Russians feel that the United States has abandoned Ukraine. that the United States is not going to continue to send its weapons and support, that they can continue to engage in these negotiations while pressing forward on the battlefield to try to get a better position. That seems to be what they've done for the entirety of Trump's time in office, and that seems to be the pathway that they're moving forward on. So I would say for the Russians, I don't know if they need to escalate or if they're just at the same pace that they have been, which is to generally continue to try to build up the pressure. The amount of air attacks have escalated, but I think that is also due to the fact that this is the first time they've had it at their capacity to fire these many drones and these many missiles. So it's not an escalation through like a deliberate thought of now's the time we're going to use the weapons we've been holding back, you know, Kamehameha level whatever. Like no, they're throwing what they now have at their disposal. So they've escalated through capacity, just like the Ukrainians have increased their drone capacity to launch more drones at Russia than Russia ever could have dreamed to launch at them. The Ukrainians seem to be in the public accepting position of freeze it along the line of contact, where they don't like the idea of solidifying any occupation. They don't like the idea of, you know, not getting any justice when it comes to certain war crimes committed or XYZ, any of these important issues, but that the solidifying the line where it is right now would be better than the war dragging out. That seems to be the public negotiating position, and when you ask the general public, they seem to be comfortable with that right now. That doesn't mean we accept Russian occupation or XYZ when you ask them, but they're saying like we would just like the fighting to stop for the very least right now, so that is the position. On the Russian side, they make inherent demands for the loss of Donetsk and Luhansk, and there seems to be some reporting indicating that if they take these regions, or if they're even offered in negotiations, they could just say, okay, Kherson, Zaporizhia, it's in the Constitution, you have to give these areas back, which all of these are non-starters, but after the human safari, it's impossible to see any Ukrainian agreeing to that, so it puts us at a very difficult position for trying to get a settlement.
Wow. This is super eye-opening, I'm telling you, because when I look at it from just like a 10,000 foot view, it's so easy to miss all of these details, because when I tell you none of it is covered, I mean absolutely none of it is covered. You have to go watch your X or your YouTube, or you have to go find an independent journalist to actually like say these things, because the other media sites, they're either curated or they just don't care. Is that what you're seeing with what's happening? What, like, this should be the most reported one, because when you talk about 1 million dead by the end of this year, that's the biggest thing that people should be like, hey, we need to stop this killing, right?
I think it's a few things. I think it's partially the algorithm. It controls what you care about. It tells you what to care about. It serves it up to you on a plate, and Ukraine is not the hot dish anymore. Okay, it's not that sandwich that just released. It's not that new flavor, new musician, new whatever. It's not new. It's old. There was another international war in between it, and then there was another one stacked on top of that, with now the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think for a lot of people, the hot reporting or hot money was elsewhere when it comes to the API and the viewership you're going to get. This is not something I just direct towards mainstream media, by the way. This is something I also direct towards alternative media. Mainstream media, a lot of it went astray because it was motivated by corporate incentives. It was motivated by financial incentives.
Gotcha.
Alternative media is not like, you're completely protected from this incentive. You're completely protected from what's going to get that number to be bigger on your YouTube account, or what's going to grow your financial stature, what's going to rise your profile, what you can make an incendiary comment about in order to ingratiate yourself deeper in the algorithm while delivering a more shallow and more shallow and more shallow product, because you're not talking about something you understand deeply. You're talking about the flavor of the week. And so I think a lot of it is just the financial incentive that has rotted mainstream media has also now slowly rotted alternative media, and we live in a bleak time for media.
Yeah. The last question I have for you, because there's a bunch of things I could actually ask you, is I know I probably should have positioned this question better, like instead of being like, what's the craziest thing? I actually really want you to walk us through like what it feels like to be a soldier on the front line, and like, is it like you wake up and you've got missiles flying over your head? Because I know it's probably different for different years, right? but like, are they bored half the time? Are they terrified? Is the average person just sitting there like terrible morale and he's like, when am I going to get off the front line? Is he shooting constantly? Are they, what is it like in your personal experience, plus what you know of talking to soldiers?
Okay, I'll talk about what I think about it from the soldier's experience, and then I'll talk about my personal experience, because the former is more important. The latter is, what I've seen, right? So for former, you got your salami, you've got your nonstop energy drink, you got an endless amount of vapes powering you through your day. After you wake up, scrolling through your phone between whether it be artillery launches, mortar launches, FPV missions. Some people have books. Most people doom scroll. TikTok or whatever, it could be YouTube Shorts or whatever it is, people messaging their loved ones, texting and such, trying to keep in contact, mostly underground. You don't want to be above ground very often. The more you're above ground and you're out in the open, the more chances you have to die, either through shrapnel and an artillery bombardment, just spraying, some shrapnel in your direction or tearing you in half, or one of the FPV drones that is constantly patrolling, looking for any movement whatsoever to strike you and attack you. This is also true for night bomber drones, grenade dropping drones. You could step in the grass, which yesterday there wasn't a mine there, but today there is. And they drop them directly in the tall grass so you don't see them. So every time you step forward, you got to put your foot forward and move the grass a little, move the grass a little. And when you have to do that to get to position for 22 kilometers, 22 to 25 kilometers, which was my experience, at least in Truskivka, that can be quite a challenge. That can be quite difficult. And so I think when it comes to the constant, the daily experience of a soldier, it's you live underground, you are sustained by, meat sticks, vapes, cigarettes, and doom scrolling, and energy drinks, lots and lots of energy drinks. When you come to the surface, it is to quickly do your work, whether it is firing a mortar and deploying your drone, and then immediately trying to get underground as soon as possible. The most dangerous part of your job is rotating in and out of position, because when you move, that's when you have the highest chance of fatality. That's when they can see your vehicle if you're driving on the roads, or see you walking from tree line to tree line, from building to building, whatever method you want to use. I've been advised different methods by different people. I went to Truskivka both ways to just see what both ways was like. And I gotta say, why on the ground is probably more terrifying, because you can hear the drones, you have to directly jump, you can see it 10 meters away. You bring much more attention to yourself with a car and a vehicle when you're driving around. It's just much easier to spot, and they know what roadways you have to go down to get to the positions you need to get to. So I would say that that's probably what the daily experience is like. When it comes to like the audio sounds you're gonna hear, constant drone buzzing, artillery in the distance, which we call thunder without the storm, because it's a constant thundering in the distance, but there's no clouds, it's a perfectly sunny day. And the grad bombardments is more like a more rapid boom, 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 because it's more of a, almost like a drum beat as it makes impacts onto the ground.
That I would say, so that kind of reflects probably what it's like now, but it wasn't like that probably early on, because there was a lot more figuring out what people should and shouldn't do, because it's the first time. Well, not really first time. They've been in conflicts before.
Well,
but like
tanks got blown up.
Yeah. So like,
early on, it was much more like a traditional interstate war, like you would have imagined in the movies that you would have seen in your Call of Duty, up until like maybe the last 5-6 years ago, before they started to actually experiment with drones in the more recent games. Where you could see tank battles, you could see people with RPGs jumping out and firing and hitting the tanks. You could see like positions 500 meters away from each other where you could see the other enemy position. You can say, oh, there they are right over here. Dylan, get in this trench. There they are. This World War II era machine gun is what divides us from them. Which, you could see just any amount of equipment brought out onto the field by territorial defense units, which are basically just local militias, local villagers who take in guns, and they've been given authority by the Ukrainian government to defend their homes, which was my case for my first embed in April of 22 in the Zaporizhia region. We were spotted by a drone there, and we took like 15 minutes to like, oh, what are we going to do? Are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? 15 minutes, you'd be dead 3 times if you waited that long in today's war.
Wow.
So now you said you're personal, because that was the former. The latter is like when you're reporting, when you're on the ground, are you dodging, grenades and stuff like that? Or are you further back? Like, are you right next to the soldier?
It depends. I mean, I try to embed with every level. I mean, I'll be at a stabilization point where they're bringing the wounded back, and I'll film that and film what that experience is like. It's psychologically for doctors, what it's like for the men who are going through some of the worst moments probably of their entire lives in those moments, trying to like report on it with some level of dignity. And in those situations, I'm not in much danger. Of course, that stabilization points have been hit, but I'm not in much danger. But I'm also in situations where, like my first embed, military embed, I was 500 meters from the Russians, meaning that if they attacked, we were the first ones, our line, our little farmhouse, and a grain storage unit was going to be the thing dividing the Russians from, deeper into the country. And so in situations like that, that was pretty dangerous, but I wouldn't say it is as dangerous as it is now, because in the last embed, I mean, there was like an FPV 10 meters from my head, and my fixer had to shoot it down with a shotgun. And thank goodness my fixer had a shotgun in that situation, because if he didn't, I mean, it might have come back around. I just threw myself in the bush like it was my mother's arms, and it turned out okay. But that was just once, like multiple times going in and out, we had to get down, and like, thankfully I was with a Ukrainian cyborg. These are people who fought in Donetsk airport back in 2014. These are killers if there are killers. And he just set up like a turret shooting like drone down after drone down, like just as they were moving around in the area. And so if you're moving on the front line now, this drone threat is ever present. Whether you're an aid worker, whether you're a civilian, or whether you are a soldier, you have to deal with the threat of drones because they're just constantly looking for targets. And so I think that is the main difference, is now Ukraine and Russia has fully gone into a war of drone dominance.
Wow. I think this has been an incredible.
Sorry, last question. I'm sorry.
I got one.
We'll get two. We'll get two.
Segue. All right, two more questions.
I can take I'll take all the time you need. I'm perfectly fine.
One of what you're saying, have you had any personal like near-death experiences being on the front line from like something that like
the drone, dude?
Well, no, I know the drone, but like again, there's any infinite number of situations where like, or maybe one of your buddies who you guys are working with, or your crew, like any near-death experiences to where like you literally thought like this is my last day or anything like that, or has it kind of been more calm?
I will say, when there was like one soldier here and one soldier there in Druzkivka shooting at like different drones from different directions, while my fixer is like, I can see they're running out of ammunition, so they're like loading the bullets, putting it in, firing, taking it out, reloading the bullets. And I'm in a situation like that where it's like, well, we just run out of ammunition. Like, we can throw the gun at it, but that's not going to do us much help. And so there's situations like that. But I think, honestly, in Kherson, I got very lucky because I was supposed to be in the boat that was hit by the Russian mortar, the 80 millimeter mortar adjusted and the 120 millimeter mortar that they come in with. They start with a smaller mortar to see where they hit, and then the second mortar is with adjusted fire. It's in order to save ammunition, so they don't just use the biggest bombs first immediately. But it hit the aid boat that I was supposed to be in, and my good friend John Jones. I mean, he's like a nearly 70-year-old man who was a policeman in the Bahamas. What a cool job that must have been, boating around in the Bahamas as a boat cop. But he tried to put these services to help to get the elderly and the wounded and other people out of their homes, and they hit the boat as he was coming back on the shoreline. He got dragged away. Thankfully the shrapnel like ricocheted off of his bones, but I was supposed to be sitting next to him, and the bunker that I was told by Ukrainian police that was unlocked was actually locked. So I just had to hide between buildings as we waited for John Jones, get evacuated and get to safety.
Wow. So you've been there since basically the start of the conflict, or damn near close to it. And you mentioned it earlier, and this is my final question for the interview because it's something I'm very interested in. You touched on it. We'd be remiss not to talk about it. The Kursk operation, right? The counteroffensive into Russia. Can you explain that to people? Because you were getting into that a little bit, and I think it's important for people to know. Most people don't even know it happened anymore.
Sure, yeah. So I was supposed to be like in that operation, but like, you make a deal with like a Chechen, but then the Chechen doesn't deliver, and then you work around it and whatever. But I wasn't there, but I did a documentary in the Sumy Oblast, and I interviewed a lot of people that were there once they got back about the operation. And essentially what the Ukrainians did is they gathered up infantry personnel and armored personnel and had them just kind of like hide around in the countryside, and they slowly built up their forces, while the message that was being put out by the government and by some like counterintelligence was, oh, these are forces preparing in case the Russians start a new axis of attack. And so the Russians didn't like properly prepare for if the Ukrainians were actually going to launch a major operation. And they then dropped jamming devices on the other side of the border to jam Russian drone activity. And then they hit a lot of the bases of command and for like the major center points of the Russian defenses, and had Ukrainian forces break across the border and invade into Kursk. This wasn't the first time the Ukrainians had raided across the border. I just interviewed like 3 or 4 days ago the head ideologist of the Russian Volunteer Corps, and talked to them a little bit about their raids into Belgorod and Bryansk and these other raids that got a lot less coverage. But this was the one that had the most success, where the Ukrainians were actually able to occupy Russian towns for an extended period of time. And what many people saw as Zelensky positioning and trying to grab Russian land in order to negotiate that land back for Ukrainian land, in order to increase their negotiating table, like the amount of cards they have, to use some Trumpian philosophy, to increase their amount of cards, so that when they come to the negotiating table, they can say, hey, you know what? You want back this area in Russia? Give us back this area you're occupying in Ukraine. But then when the negotiations didn't really go anywhere, the extended stay of the Ukrainians just became more and more of a drain, really, more than any type of tangible military benefit. And so eventually they had to pull out after increasing pressure from both Ukrainian forces, Russian forces, and North Korean forces, which was not originally expected, I imagine.
Wow.
Yeah, I won't go into the North Korea stuff. Well, maybe that'll be my last question, because I actually really am curious about the North Korea stuff. As the North Koreans came into the conflict, I'm guessing they were ill prepared. A lot of them died, maybe didn't die. Are they still active? Like, what's the situation when it comes to North Korea with them being involved?
So a lot of them had to adjust essentially on the fly to this type of war, where they had been training all their lives for a war in the Korean Peninsula, and now they're fighting a war in Eastern Europe, with a lot of these people that you come up in North Korean military academy, or through the training system. You train and then you fight with the same people, and so you're training with your buddies, expecting to fight for some war of Korean liberation, or however they want to frame it, and now you're with your buddies, like on the border of Russia, fighting Ukrainian drone pilots in a war that is definitely not how they showed it in the propaganda films, when it comes to the type of targeting from drones. And early on, you can see a lot of North Koreans kind of getting taken out by drones as they wandered openly in the field, and they're kind of adjusting to this type of warfare. But through very bloody trial and error sessions, the North Koreans eventually adapted to this. The training of these soldiers adapted to this as well, where they're having North Koreans train other North Koreans instead of Russians who don't always know how to speak Korean, trying to train these people to the best of their ability. And so they have learned, just like everybody else has learned, and they now mostly do like border work. There's no evidence of them invading into Ukraine proper. I think that there might be some diplomatic worry that, well, the North Korean, you could say, right now you can make an argument, North Korean soldiers invading Europe, somebody could try to make that argumentation. But if North Korean soldiers are in Ukraine, it's a lot easier to say North Korea invades Europe. And I think that there might be some fear of that type of image.
That makes perfect sense. Well, we appreciate you coming on. We need to do this again. I also want to get him on like a bigger show. Just like, dude, you're insane. I think these things are super awesome. As far as where people can keep up with your journey, your journalism, like where do they find you? Sure.
So you can find me on Twitter at DylanBurns 1776, DylanBurns 1776. If you wanted to. What was that?
I was just saying, our guy in the back, and our producer, Wes, go ahead and pull up his X account for us, please.
Cool. But if now that I give personal opinions on there, if you just care about my journalism and not about my personal opinions, Dylan Burns TV on YouTube is where I release my documentaries, and I write articles for offbeatresearch.com. I interviewed a soldier who's fighting in Konstantinivka very, very recently for them. I'm going to be releasing an article on mid-range strike drones for them in the future. And I just released a documentary on air defense in Odessa, which is a very beautiful city, very historic city. We also film a lot of art from the city. We go to the opera house there. It's very beautiful. And so if people want to go check that out, I released that on Saturday. So people can go give that a view on Dylan Burns TV.
I think it's really fascinating, man, just kind of like from a meta level perspective of all, like, we're all young people, right? And I think young people are getting more like politically and geopolitically engaged, you know, in endeavors like real reporting, real journalism, people being there on the ground, you know. When I watch the news, when we watch the news, we see a lot of old people telling us like how the world is and what's going on. And oftentimes they're not the ones with skin in the game. So agree, disagree, whatever. I think that you have really a lot of integrity by being there.
Yep.
And that's a big call.
100%.
For sure. So I think that's very important. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
I appreciate you having me on. I think it's important that there's more independent journalists going and filming on the ground in these countries. I mean, mainstream press isn't putting war correspondents out there as much anymore. They find it much easier to just take people's social media feeds or whatever they recorded on their phone and just take that, show it on the screen, have some talking to come on and pontificate and pontificate and pontificate. But it's really important for people to go out there and you know, put some shit on the line in order to get some reporting done. It really is important. So I hope other people get into the industry or whatever you want to call it.
100%. Well, all I have to say, man, is you just keep being safe out there, dude. Like, honestly, you're doing the Lord's work by just covering this in the first place and putting yourself out there. We want to be able to do this again, have you back on, get your latest reports on what you have seen since the last time that we have talked today. But we really appreciate you taking your time today.
Sure. My DMs are always open. My email's always open. Reach out at any time.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Dylan.
Have a good one.